What if the most important casualty in the Iran conflict isn't even Iran, but China? While the world is watching Tehran, the IRGC, and the Strait of Hormuz blockade, there is a second layer of this war that almost nobody is talking about. A layer that has not seen a single bomb dropped on it, not a single missile fired toward it, and yet is quietly absorbing one of the most serious strategic shocks in modern geopolitics. That country is China. Over the past 2 days, I've gone deep into reporting, strategic analysis, and economic data from multiple sources, including Bloomberg, policy institutes, and documented energy trade records. And what emerges is a picture that looks very different from the public narrative. China, which positioned itself as a distant observer in this conflict, is actually one of the biggest structural victims of what is unfolding in the Middle East right now. To understand why, you have to look at what China spent more than a decade building inside Iran. In 2021, Beijing and Tehran signed a long-term strategic cooperation framework valued at around $400 billion. On paper, it looked like a powerful alliance designed to reshape trade routes, energy flows, and infrastructure across West Asia. Iran was not just another partner. It was supposed to become a central pillar in China's westward expansion under the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies were deeply embedded in Iran's economic system. Energy projects at massive gas fields like South Pars were tied to Chinese participation. Telecommunications infrastructure was supported through major Chinese tech firms. Ports such as Chabahar and Jask were developed with Chinese-linked investment to give Iran alternative export routes, designed to reduce dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, a large portion of Iran's oil exports began moving through indirect shipping routes, often labeled under third countries, but ultimately flowing toward Chinese refineries. At its peak, China was purchasing close to 90% of Iran's exported oil, creating a quiet but critical energy channel that helped Tehran survive under sanctions, while giving Beijing access to heavily discounted crude. It was not a formal military alliance, but it functioned as a deeply interconnected economic system built on mutual necessity. However, when US and Israeli strikes against Iran escalated in early 2026, the reaction from Beijing was strikingly limited. There were statements of concern, diplomatic language about stability, and calls for restraint, but no real strategic intervention, no material support, and no meaningful attempt to alter the situation on the ground. That silence revealed something important. What China had built in Iran was not a true strategic alliance in the traditional sense. It was closer to a resource-driven partnership, highly efficient when flows were stable, but extremely fragile under military pressure. And as soon as that pressure intensified, the structure began to break apart. With the Strait of Hormuz under disruption and Iranian export routes being targeted or intercepted, the entire energy network China relied on started to destabilize. Tankers that once moved quietly through shadow shipping systems began facing increased monitoring and interception. Vessels connected to Iranian oil routes were flagged, stopped, or redirected. What had once been a smooth, hidden supply chain started turning into a contested and highly exposed network. From Beijing's perspective, this was not just a Middle Eastern crisis. It was the gradual collapse of a major energy corridor that had quietly supported parts of its industrial system for years. And as the situation escalated, China's official response remained cautious, limited mostly to diplomatic statements about efforts and stability, while the actual system it depended on continued to weaken in real time. This is where the story stops being about regional conflict and starts becoming something much larger. Because the disruption in Iran is not contained within Iran. It is spreading outward into the global supply system that China depends on, and the effects are only beginning to surface. As the pressure on Iranian export routes increases, the consequences are no longer confined to regional politics. They are now feeding directly into the global energy system that China depends on every single day. What once looked like a distant geopolitical confrontation is beginning to behave like a supply chain shockwave, and Beijing is now forced to deal with the consequences in real time rather than in theory. The Strait of Hormuz is at the center of this shift. For decades, it has been one of the most important choke points in global energy flows, carrying a massive share of oil shipments from the Gulf to Asia. China alone depends heavily on this corridor, with millions of barrels per day historically moving through this narrow passage toward its refineries. When the disruption began, the assumption in many Chinese strategic circles was that alternative routes, stockpiles, and indirect supply channels could absorb the impact. But what is actually happening on the ground is far more difficult to manage. As U.S. naval forces increased pressure on Iranian-linked maritime activity, tanker movements through the region began to change rapidly. Ships that were once part of a loosely organized shadow network now faced tracking, interception, and in some cases forced diversion. The system that quietly transported discounted Iranian crude into Chinese-linked supply chains is being dismantled piece by piece. This is not happening through a single decisive action. It is happening through sustained pressure on maritime routes, insurance systems, port access, and vessel identification. Each layer of the logistics chain is being disrupted, and together they form a breakdown that cannot be easily replaced. For China, the scale of exposure is significant. A large portion of its energy imports from the Gulf region depends on predictable maritime flow through Hormuz. Even small interruptions create immediate stress in refinery operations, shipping schedules, and pricing stability. While official Chinese reserves can buffer short-term shocks, they are not designed to sustain prolonged disruption without consequences to industrial output. At the same time, the alternative narrative that Russia can fully compensate for lost Gulf supply does not match the physical reality of global energy logistics. Russian exports to China, while significant, are constrained by pipeline capacity, shipping limitations, and alternative routing risks. Even combined, they do not fully replace the scale of Gulf-origin crude that flows through Hormuz. This imbalance is now becoming more visible inside China's industrial economy. In recent weeks, early indicators have started to show stress in manufacturing output. Automotive production, one of China's most important strategic industries, has already experienced measurable slowdowns. Reports from industrial data sources suggest sharp reductions in output compared to previous periods, driven not only by demand fluctuations, but also by rising input costs linked to energy and petrochemical supply disruptions. These effects are not abstract. They are showing up in factories, logistics hubs, and regional production centers. When petrochemical inputs become more expensive or delayed, entire manufacturing chains begin to adjust. Plastic production, electronics packaging, industrial materials, and automotive components all depend on stable flows of oil-derived inputs. When those flows tighten, the impact spreads across multiple sectors at once. What makes the situation more sensitive is that China's economy is already operating under slower growth conditions compared to previous decades. That means there is less room to absorb external shocks without visible consequences. Even modest disruptions in energy supply can translate into measurable pressure on employment, production, and regional industrial stability. This is where the Hormuz crisis stops being a regional conflict and becomes a systemic economic stress test for China's entire development model. Beijing is now facing a situation where its energy security, industrial stability, and geopolitical strategy are all being affected simultaneously. The Belt and Road framework that was designed to secure long-term trade corridors is being tested in real conditions of military tension and maritime enforcement. And as these pressures build, the question is no longer whether China has invested heavily in Iran or the Middle East. The question is whether those investments can survive in an environment where control over maritime choke points is being actively contested and reshaped. Because what is emerging from this crisis is not just disruption. It is a demonstration of how quickly global supply systems can shift when strategic waterways become contested zones, and how exposed even the largest economies remain when their energy lifelines depend on a handful of narrow passages under external pressure. As the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz continues to intensify, the effects begin to extend far beyond shipping lanes and naval operations. What started as a regional security crisis is now reshaping global commodity flows in real time. And China is increasingly feeling the pressure not at the political level first, but at the industrial core of its economy. One of the most important developments is the rapid deterioration of what was once a hidden but highly efficient energy pipeline between Iran and China. For years, Iranian crude oil moved through a complex shadow shipping system involving vessel transfers, falsified routing data, and indirect labeling through third countries. This system allowed China to access discounted energy while maintaining plausible distance from sanctions pressure. But that entire structure is now under sustained disruption. As maritime enforcement increases in and around the Gulf region, vessels connected to Iranian oil flows are being tracked more aggressively. Tankers that once operated under ambiguous identification patterns are now being flagged, inspected, or intercepted. The result is not just a reduction in volume, but a breakdown in predictability. And predictability is what modern energy systems depend on more than almost anything else. Chinese customs data appears to show minimal direct imports from Iran in recent years, but alternative routing patterns tell a very different story. Large volumes of crude that were previously labeled under intermediary ports or re-export hubs are now being exposed as part of a broader, hidden supply chain. This system worked only as long as maritime enforcement remained limited and fragmented. Once that changed, the structure began to collapse. At the same time, the disruption in Hormuz is not only affecting Iranian-linked supply chains. It is also impacting broader Gulf energy exports that flow through the same corridor. That means China is not just losing a shadow supply channel, it is facing increased friction in mainstream energy imports as well. This dual pressure is what makes the situation particularly serious. On one side, the discounted supply system is weakening. On the other, the primary legal supply routes are becoming more expensive, more uncertain, and more exposed to risk premiums in shipping, insurance, and logistics. Inside China's industrial system, the early signs of this stress are becoming visible. Petrochemical prices have started to fluctuate sharply. Inputs used in plastics, packaging, electronics, manufacturing, and automotive production are becoming more volatile. When these materials become unstable in pricing or availability, manufacturers are forced to adjust production schedules, delay output, or absorb higher costs. That is already translating into real economic effects. Reports from industrial regions in southern and eastern China indicate sudden factory shutdowns linked to rising material costs and disrupted supply chains. In some areas, production lines have paused unexpectedly, leading to worker protests over unpaid wages and lost income. These protests are not politically driven in the traditional sense. They are the direct result of economic pressure filtering down from global supply disruptions. This is a critical point that often gets missed in geopolitical analysis. The impact of Hormuz is not limited to oil prices in global markets. It moves through a chain reaction. Shipping disruption leads to energy uncertainty, which leads to petrochemical instability, which leads to industrial cost spikes, which ultimately leads to production slowdowns and labor tension. China sits at the center of that chain. Even sectors that are strategically important to Beijing, such as electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing, are not immune. While EVs reduce long-term oil dependency, their production still relies heavily on petrochemical inputs, rare material logistics, and global shipping stability. So even China's future economy is indirectly tied to the same disrupted system. Meanwhile, official Chinese messaging continues to emphasize stability and diplomatic engagement. Statements from foreign ministry representatives focus on calls for ceasefire, de-escalation, and restoration of maritime security. But these statements do not change the physical reality on the water or the operational challenges facing shipping networks. As enforcement actions continue and uncertainty grows, the shadow system that once quietly supported a significant portion of China's energy strategy is being steadily dismantled. And what replaces it is not a new stable system, but a more expensive and more tightly controlled global energy environment. At this stage, the crisis is no longer just about Iran or even the Strait of Hormuz. It is becoming a broader test of how resilient China's industrial and energy structure really is when long-standing assumptions about cheap, reliable external supply begin to break down under geopolitical pressure. As the shockwaves from the Strait of Hormuz continue to spread, the crisis begins to move deeper into the physical structure of China's economy. What was initially treated as a distant geopolitical disruption is now directly affecting factories, production lines, and supply networks inside China itself. The impact is no longer theoretical or external. It is operational. One of the clearest signs of this shift is emerging in China's manufacturing sector. Industrial output data from early April 2026 shows a noticeable slowdown in key production areas, especially in automotive manufacturing. In some cases, vehicle output has dropped significantly compared to the same period the previous year. This is not the result of a single factor, but a combination of rising input costs, unstable supply chains, and reduced predictability in energy and petrochemical availability. The automotive sector is particularly important because it sits at the center of China's industrial transformation strategy. It is not just about cars. It connects to batteries, semiconductors, steel production, electronics, and advanced materials. When this sector slows down, it sends a signal across multiple layers of the economy at once. At the same time, China is facing rising pressure from upstream material costs. The disruption in Hormuz has created volatility in petrochemical markets, affecting everything from plastics to industrial chemicals. These materials are essential for packaging, consumer goods, electronics, and construction supply chains. When their prices increase or their delivery becomes uncertain, factories are forced to either slow production or absorb higher costs, both of which reduce efficiency and margins. This is where the crisis begins to move from global geopolitics into local economic stress. In several regions of southern China, reports have emerged of factory closures linked to sudden cost spikes in raw materials. These closures have not been gradual. In some cases, production has stopped abruptly, leaving workers without income and creating immediate social tension. In at least a few documented instances, workers have protested outside factory gates over unpaid wages, demanding compensation for sudden shutdowns. The presence of these protests is significant not because of their scale, but because of what they represent. In China, public demonstrations linked to labor disputes are usually tightly controlled and rare in visible form. The fact that they are still occurring suggests that economic pressure is strong enough to override normal containment mechanisms at the local level. What makes this even more sensitive is that these disruptions are not caused by domestic policy changes alone. They are tied directly to external supply chain instability. The interruption of shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz has increased costs for petrochemical inputs, disrupted delivery schedules, and added uncertainty to production planning. That uncertainty is now being felt by workers on the ground. Half of the world's maritime trade in key industrial materials flows through regions affected by this crisis. This includes sulfur, petrochemical derivatives, and aluminum-related inputs, all of which are essential for global manufacturing systems. When those flows are disrupted, the impact is not isolated to one country. It spreads across multiple industries and supply chains simultaneously. China, because of its position as the world's largest manufacturing hub, is disproportionately exposed to these disruptions. Its factories depend on stable input flows more than almost any other major economy. Even small increases in cost or delays in delivery can cascade through entire production networks. This is especially critical for sectors like electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing, which are central to China's long-term economic strategy. While these industries are often presented as a way to reduce dependency on traditional energy imports, they are still deeply dependent on global supply chains for materials, chemicals, and industrial inputs. That means they are still indirectly affected by the same disruptions originating in the Strait of Hormuz. At the macro level, economists are already warning that sustained disruption could make it harder for China to meet its annual growth targets. Projections that once assumed stable external conditions are now being revised under the assumption of higher input costs and reduced export competitiveness. What is emerging is a layered pressure system. At the top level, there is geopolitical instability in the Middle East. Below that, there is maritime disruption in key shipping corridors. Beneath that, there is volatility in energy and petrochemical markets. And at the ground level, there are factories slowing down, workers losing shifts, and production chains adjusting in real time. Each layer reinforces the others. And as this continues, China is being forced into a position where it must manage not just external diplomacy and energy strategy, but also the internal economic consequences of a global system that is becoming increasingly unstable and difficult to predict. As the pressure builds across China's industrial system, the next phase of the crisis becomes even more direct and uncomfortable. It moves from production slowdowns into visible social and economic stress at the factory level. What was once a geopolitical energy dispute is now clearly interacting with real workers, real wages, and real disruptions inside China's domestic economy. One of the most striking developments comes from southern industrial regions, where multiple factories experienced sudden shutdowns after input costs spiked sharply. The trigger in many of these cases is not a single policy change or domestic economic reform, but the ripple effect of disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. As petrochemical prices rose and supply chains became less reliable, production margins collapsed almost overnight. In several documented incidents, workers gathered outside closed factory gates, demanding unpaid wages and compensation. Banners reading messages like, "Return our hard-earned money," appeared in protest scenes. While these events remain localized, their significance is much larger than the individual factories involved. They represent a direct transmission of global geopolitical instability into China's labor market. These shutdowns are closely tied to rising costs in key industrial materials, especially plastics and petrochemical derivatives. These inputs are essential across China's manufacturing ecosystem, from packaging and electronics to automotive parts and consumer goods. When the price of these materials rises suddenly, factories that operate on tight margins often have no choice but to pause production entirely. This is where the structure of the global supply chain becomes visible in a very concrete way. Half of global maritime trade in several critical industrial inputs flows through or is influenced by the Strait of Hormuz. When that corridor becomes unstable, the effects do not remain confined to oil prices alone. They spread across fertilizers, aluminum production, sulfur supply, and petrochemical processing. For China, this matters more than for most countries, because its entire economic model is built around large-scale manufacturing efficiency. The system depends on stable and predictable flows of imported raw materials combined with high-volume export production. Any disruption in that balance immediately creates stress across multiple layers of the economy. At the same time, China is also facing a structural challenge in its growth outlook. Even before the current crisis, economists had already noted that growth rates were slowing compared to earlier decades. Now, with additional pressure from energy volatility and supply chain disruption, forecasts are becoming more conservative. Some projections suggest that achieving previous growth targets will be significantly more difficult under current conditions. The automotive industry is one of the clearest indicators of this pressure. As one of China's strategic sectors, it is deeply tied to both domestic consumption and global exports. Recent data showing a sharp decline in vehicle production over short time periods reflects not just reduced demand, but also constrained input availability and higher production costs. When factories slow output in this sector, the effects ripple outward into steel, electronics, battery production, and logistics networks. What makes this situation more complex is that China is simultaneously trying to transition toward higher-value industries like electric vehicles, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing. However, these sectors are not isolated from global supply chains. In fact, they are often even more dependent on specialized materials and stable international logistics than traditional industries. So while China's long-term strategy is designed to reduce vulnerability to external energy shocks, in the short term, it remains exposed to precisely the kind of disruption now emerging through Hormuz-related instability. This creates a contradiction in the system. The more China tries to modernize its industrial base, the more it relies on complex global supply chains that are themselves vulnerable to geopolitical pressure. That means external shocks do not become less relevant over time. In some cases, they become more impactful. Meanwhile, inside the country, the combination of rising costs, production interruptions, and localized labor disputes is creating a feedback loop of uncertainty. Factories adjust output due to cost spikes, workers react to sudden shutdowns, and regional economies absorb the impact through reduced income and consumption. This is not a collapse scenario, but it is a stress scenario where multiple pressures converge at once. And what makes it particularly significant is that these pressures are not isolated domestic issues. They are directly linked to global energy routes, maritime security, and strategic choke points thousands of kilometers away. As a result, China is now operating in an environment where its internal economic stability is increasingly tied to external geopolitical developments it does not fully control. And that dependency is becoming more visible with each new disruption in the global supply chain. At this stage of the crisis, the situation surrounding China is no longer just about disrupted shipments or temporary factory slowdowns. It has evolved into a broader structural test of how resilient the entire Chinese economic model really is when its external lifelines come under sustained pressure. And what is becoming increasingly clear is that the system is operating under conditions of tightening constraint rather than expansion. One of the most important numbers in this entire situation is China's exposure to Gulf energy flows. Millions of barrels of oil per day have historically moved from the Middle East toward Chinese refineries, much of it passing through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a marginal supply source. It is a core pillar of China's industrial energy base. When that flow becomes unstable, there is no immediate substitute that matches the same scale, cost, and reliability. There is often an assumption that Russia can fully compensate for disruptions in Gulf supply, but the physical reality is more limited. Russian exports to China, while significant, are constrained by infrastructure, pipeline capacity, and maritime logistics. Even combined with other alternative sources, they do not fully replace the scale of Gulf crude that China depends on. This means that any prolonged disruption in Hormuz creates a structural gap, not just a temporary inconvenience. To manage this, China has stockpiled oil aggressively in anticipation of potential crises. But stockpiles are not a permanent solution. They are a buffer, a time delay mechanism that allows short-term stability but does not solve long-term supply imbalance. And according to multiple energy assessments, that buffer is not infinite. Depending on consumption rates and import disruptions, the effective runway may be measured in months rather than years. At the same time, internal economic indicators are beginning to reflect stress. Industrial production data suggests slower output in key sectors, particularly those tied to automotive manufacturing and heavy industry. The automotive sector is especially important because it acts as a central hub for multiple supply chains, including steel, semiconductors, batteries, and electronics. When output declines in this sector, it signals broader industrial hesitation. This is compounded by rising input costs across petrochemicals and raw materials. As shipping through key maritime corridors becomes more uncertain, insurance premiums increase, logistics costs rise, and delivery schedules become less predictable. These changes do not just affect large corporations. They filter down into factory-level decisions, wage stability, and regional employment patterns. What is emerging inside China is a multi-layered pressure system. At the top is geopolitical instability in the Middle East. Beneath that is maritime disruption in strategic choke points. Below that is volatility in global energy and commodity markets. And at the ground level are factories adjusting production, workers reacting to sudden shutdowns, and local economies absorbing the shock. This layered structure is what makes the situation more serious than a standard economic slowdown. It is not driven by a single domestic policy error or a cyclical downturn. It is driven by external constraints that affect multiple parts of the system simultaneously. At the same time, Beijing's official response remains focused on diplomatic language. Calls for stability, ceasefire arrangements, and peaceful resolution continue to dominate public statements. There is also an effort to position China as a neutral actor or even a mediator in the broader crisis. But diplomacy does not immediately resolve the physical constraints of shipping lanes, energy flows, or industrial input shortages. This gap between political messaging and economic reality is becoming more noticeable as the crisis continues. On one side, there is a narrative of stability and control. On the other side, there are factories slowing down, supply chains adjusting, and energy flows becoming more expensive and less predictable. What the Strait of Hormuz crisis has ultimately revealed is not just a regional vulnerability, but a global one. It has exposed how deeply interconnected modern industrial economies are with a small number of critical maritime choke points. And it has shown that even the largest manufacturing power in the world remains dependent on systems that lie far beyond its direct control. For China, this moment is less about immediate collapse and more about strategic exposure. The fortress model that emphasized resilience and internal strength is now being tested against a reality where external supply chains can be disrupted quickly and at scale. And as the situation continues to evolve, the most important question is no longer what happens to Iran or the Strait of Hormuz alone. It is what happens to global manufacturing, energy security, and economic stability when the world's most critical supply routes become active zones of geopolitical pressure.